Hello everyone. Welcome to Is It Possible to Party with the Planet? Thanks for coming out this afternoon. It's a beautiful afternoon, isn't it? It's very chilled. I'm Christie Anthoney. I'm working at the City of Adelaide as the Associate Director of Culture. And I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Kaurna people, the traditional country of the people of the Adelaide Plains, and pay respect to elders past and present. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and we acknowledge that they're of continuing importance to the Kaurna people today. We also extend that respect to all other Aboriginal language groups and First Nations. So welcome. I'm asked to tell you to just be COVID safe. That's quite relevant to our talk, and you'll see why in a minute. But the staff and volunteers are super friendly, and we have to abide by what they say, please. So there you go. I'm joined here today to have this fabulous conversation by three people, two with us in person. So this is Berish Bilander, who's the CEO of Green Music Australia. He's super active in the climate and social justice space, and is proud to have both worked on the Party with the Planet campaign that saw music festivals and organisers and artists promote the need to stop trashing festivals and for punters to take home all their stuff. And is equally proud to have survived the longest lockdown in the world. So welcome to Adelaide.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And I've got Montaigne. Performed last night here for the Adelaide Festival. How did it go?
It was really nice, actually. It's always strange performing to like a crowd that's sitting in masks because you have no idea what they're feeling about what you're doing, but it seemed like everyone was effusing a warm aura, I think, ultimately.
So you missed the dancing ban lifted by
just
24 hours or something,
yeah.
48 hours. Never mind. That's a nice, unusual gig. So with a raft of awards and a huge following, sold out national tours, and representing Australia last year at Eurovision, Montaigne tells me that she's delighted that this year she got to record a song with David Byrne of Talking Heads called Always Be With You. Always Be You.
Yeah.
Look it up, download it, that's awesome. And on the screen, we have Sharni Honor. Sharni's caught up with the spicy cough. She's actually not here in person because we were hoping that we could actually get away with saying Sharni's up in the hills. She's in the Adelaide Hills, and she's a local, and she's got a perspective on this that is local. And that she was trying to live by her principles and reduce her carbon footprint by not driving down here today. But that's not actually true, and she's happy for me to tell you that she's well and getting better. But nice, thanks for joining us, Sharni, on the screen behind. You two can actually also see her down here.
Oh.
Yeah. So Sharni's the award-winning creator of the Porch Sessions. Very, very amazing local woman whom I adore. And I think that the Summertown studios that she's now working on full-time are really her walking the talk and showing what she does by living her principles. So we'll just pretend you're here, Sharni, and welcome. Okay, so this is a conversation about how we're going to party and continue to live our values of connection and the human need to connect in the crisis that we're in. Berish, can we both party and reduce the impact on the climate?
I think you're going to start with me. Yes and no.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's something when we were having a pre-chat discussion, and I said to you, there's a great environmentalist called Paul Hawken, who maybe some of you know, and he talks about there being no sector that at this stage isn't degenerative. There's no sector that doesn't hurt the planet more than it heals the planet, which is a pretty shocking thing when we look at it for face value, and the arts are no different, unfortunately. Probably in many ways much less damaging than other sectors and industries.
Yeah.
But still, I think the arts being so conscientious and always at the vanguard when it comes to the social issues of our time, you know, whether it was apartheid or civil rights, and now obviously climate is right up there, climate change. So I think artists that are speaking up loudly, and therefore everyone's looking really closely.
That's right, a bit of a lightning rod to the values principle, which often then shines a spotlight on how you can actually live the principles. How do you do it, Montaigne?
How I do it?
Yeah.
I suppose, I mean, I used to work with Berish in Green Music Australia. I was on the board for a bit, and my role there was to, I guess, help do outreach with other artists, with my peers, and see if they would like to get involved with the campaign of awareness around these issues. So, you know, working to reduce single-use plastics and consumables at festivals and things like that was part of that, and also a climate declaration that I helped get a bunch of artists signed onto. So I don't know, I often feel like my practical skills are quite limited beyond art, but what I do know is how to send a message to my other artist friends and say, would you like to partake in this sort of action, I guess. So that's one of the ways in which I've helped, is being able to bring awareness to other people who also have a platform, who may also speak out about it and influence their followers, who are also often young people who look up to them and do sort of need their values guided a little bit, and need to figure out how to be young people in the world, and need to figure out what to think, I suppose. And these people definitely play a part in forming those thoughts and beliefs. And I also have done some light performance art advocacy. I don't know if it's even performance art, but just, you know, I've arrived at various public events with, I suppose when I was at the ARAs a few years ago, I was nominated for a few, I won one, and I had people over profit on my chest, which was drawn on by Ollie Henderson, who was the, I guess, founder of House of Riot, which is they do sort of these protest slogan shirts, and I think a portion of or all of the income made from the shirts is donated. I don't remember to what, this is so long ago now, but that was sort of the idea, and the People Over Profit slogan specifically. I enjoyed it as a sort of casual sort of a values proposition, but also it was tied especially to the campaign against gambling in New South Wales at the time, which is, you know, not environmentally related, but
it is. It's all social.
Well, so this is the thing, is that you know, there's a thing called intersectional environmentalism that proposes that in order to save the climate and to be, you know, someone who can be considered an environmentalist, you also have to see the worth and strive for justice in all other sectors.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, that's sort of been my work, is just a sort of general activism for, you know, issues that are of concern and worth talking
So I'm going
about.
to stick with you though and go deep. Do you ever get asked about your carbon emissions and, you know, maybe the hypocrisy of travelling around with that mission, with those words?
I personally don't. It's odd, I haven't, even on social media, I don't seem to attract a lot of naysayers, which is strange. I have a feeling, I don't know that I've ever actually strove beyond my bounds in terms of my career, and I very much sort of, I suppose, preach to the choir in all my platforms, which is good and bad, you know, but I don't have to deal with that kind of criticism much.
That's good. I mean, a lot of artists do, but that's partly because we talked about, and I'll come back to that, how when you do hold a lightning rod up to these issues, you can be looked at and interrogated. So it's great that you've managed to avoid that. But Sharni, you've obviously got some, you know, pretty significant principles around partying with the planet. Tell us where you come in on this.
Yeah, so I guess kind of spanning, we run a number of festivals in small and kind of slightly larger than small capacities. And I guess I'm kind of in a unique position where I run a business, but I also at the same time, at my absolute cornerstone, want to drive sustainability within those practices. So there is this balance of commerce and managing that, but also to integrate sustainability. And that whole topic is a very interesting space, particularly because to be sustainable is expensive. It comes at a cost, particularly in an event organisational capacity. So I think I kind of come from the standpoint of, trying to be creative within that sustainable realm of running events, and coming up with initiatives that can be creatively sustainable without costing us our entire event budget, so to speak. So our kind of like major festival that we run each year is called Porchland. It's like a 2,000 capacity festival in regional South Australia. And it's on the back of a community hall, so it's an open field, there's no infrastructure, but that is the best thing about it, is because nature is the infrastructure for that exact event. So we kind of bring in the bare minimum to be able to stage an event, and then every kind of element that we incrementally introduce is absolutely essential to the staging of that event and nothing more. And that gives us this amazing opportunity to have all of these initiatives outside of just waste management. I think in events there's a lot of emphasis on waste management as being the major outlet for how to mitigate, I guess, your footprint. But there's so many ways that you can be creative with sustainability that doesn't just speak to waste management.
Well, that's a good question. Thanks. Does it stick to waste management in your, from Party with the Planet with your campaign?
When that specific campaign, that's right. Yeah, the Party with the Planet campaign was an alliance, or is an alliance of festivals that got together to deal with. If anyone's been at one of these youth multi-day camping festivals that get quite debaucherous, very fun, and by the end of it there's a little bit of campsite Armageddon going on where everything's abandoned. That was specifically a waste-focused campaign. It continues because that problem, which is kind of an extension of our disposable society, or our attraction to convenience above maybe something that makes a lot more sense.
So how do we, I know for example in the UK that there's a camping shop that sell a festival kit, £100 and you get your tent and your sleeping bag and your little toilet potty thing and, leave it at the end. So as Sharni's saying, we're still working in an environment that's, in a capitalist environment where with the structures we have,
right.
How do these things work together?
Well, I think that's, talking to Montaigne's point, there's two things that can happen. Event organisers and the whole ecosystem that coalesces around the music scene can do more. And there are some events that absolutely lead the way when it comes to waste reduction initiatives, when it comes to setting a culture of caring, when it comes to the energy consumption, and trialling and using that space as a laboratory. It's such a great thing to be able to set something up and pull it down, and then the next year go, well, that didn't work, let's try this time. And technology's changing every year, so you try a solar stage and try the compost, try zooming someone in, or compost toilets, or whatever. So I do think festivals can lead in many ways, but then there are also limits because we're living in a system, and we're bound by infrastructure we don't create. When an artist wants to travel more sustainably in Australia, there's vast distances between shows, and it's not feasible often to ask an artist to leave their family and their home city and get on the road. While I totally support the idea of slow touring, I think there's something to that. A lot of the time it is a challenge, and I think many people would be really up for jumping on a decent train. You call it a fast train?
Yeah.
I just call it a medium speed train.
Okay.
Nice.
So there's the first idea vision for the session.
The medium
we need
speed
a fast
train.
medium space train. Okay. Good.
No, fast trains, but I think the critical thing here and why activism is so important is because the government controls the economic levers.
Yeah.
It's Montaigne, for all her best wishes, and even if every single one of your mates and high profile people stepped up and advocated that, put their money, all the record labels got involved, that would not be enough to pay for a fast train from Melbourne to Brisbane.
No.
And Adelaide, hopefully. So, that's where the
don't
government
forget
needs to
Adelaide.
flip those switches. Likewise with renewable energy, the transition from fossil fuels. And if it's going to be a just transition that doesn't leave the workers behind, government intervention is absolutely essential.
That's right. And meanwhile, Sharni's doing her best, picking out, making sure there's no cable ties and all the rest of it. But, you know, Sharni, does it feel frustrating that it's, you know, reduced to individual responsibility? Where do you think the government sits on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such this tug of war mentality, because I think whilst we're among the first to advocate for change from the top level down, there is this helplessness beyond that want and beyond that advocacy, that it's like, well, what's going to happen right now? What are we capable of doing right now, personally and in a business sense? So I think if both of those concepts can work simultaneously alongside each other, to advocate for change from the top level down, but integrate change from the ground level up, I think it has to work harmoniously.
Yeah, that we're all in agreement with that. You've got to live some principles that as best you can for the moment, whilst also advocating, you know, for what?
Structural change. Right?
Structural change. And what does that look like?
Oh.
Where do we begin?
Don, what's the vision of the future?
Well, you know, ideally you'd have progressive governments in power that actually want to, you know, inject money into public services and things like that, that actually help people to live and give them the energy to actually, like, create the infrastructure that is required to sort of green the planet, or at least to live harmoniously with the planet. I mean, there are so many levels to that, right? And part of it is like, you know, it's just so complicated, but like capitalism, right? Like, within the system of capitalism, corporations want eternal growth, want infinite growth, and that model is not sustainable, and the sort of states have, I think, they just live within this sort of system, and there's like this increasing austerity from conservative governments who believe that like accruing a debt economically is like bad or whatever, when the idea of a government is to actually spend money on the people so that, you know, the economy does flow and people do have money to spend and enough to live, and, you know, can have healthcare so they can be healthy and, you know, all this stuff. But I mean, that's ideally, like we were talking about, it's the intersectionality of like, yes, you want to regulate corporations so that they are, you know, have sustainable practices, maybe their material output is more recycled, all that stuff like that, but you also need like fair labor conditions, and you need, like you said, like a transition from old practices to new practices that doesn't leave people behind, and racial equality and all this stuff. It's just like such a big beast, and it's so hard to like speak to it. I can only speak to it as an artist, you know, sitting within the arts industry, and also just being like a citizen who, you know, this is the world I'm perceiving. But
you're also the youngest amongst us, probably. You know, I'm not sure there, Sharni, but are you getting that sense from your generation?
Which sense? That
they're taking this on, that they want
no.
No.
It seems that things are becoming, well, you know, I don't know, even the Labour Party, right? Like, they seem increasingly centre and increasingly conservative and don't seem to have a backbone, I'll say it, in terms of policy. Like, just, Labour's just kind of embarrassing now to me. And
so what to do?
Oh, God. Well, this is the question, right?
This is turning into a political discussion, evidently.
Well,
are you going to sign up? Who are you going to run for?
Run for? God. Oh, it's too stressful.
Okay.
I thought this is the thing, though, right, is that there are these governing forces in the world that we set up historically in order to look after us, and now they're not doing that, but there's still the governing forces. And the power that we have is as citizens to vote when the time comes for who is going to be the government.
Very timely in Adelaide, let me tell you.
Yeah, exactly, precisely. And that's like, I think, the most power we hold as individuals. It is, I think, at the same time, incredibly important that we take responsibility for our own output and consumption and all that stuff like that, if only to demonstrate our principles and the fact that we care about the environment and the world that we live in and each other.
Yeah.
But there is only so much that we can do. It's an interesting conundrum.
Do you think that you know, the voice of artists talking on stages at festivals can resonate? Are you finding that you know, it seems to me that a lot of music festivals are getting behind for change in your campaign?
I mean, I absolutely do. That's why I'm in this role.
Yeah.
I see the power of the arts as, you know, a cultural force that can help reshape society and our values. I mean, ultimately, I think the crisis we're in is one of imagination. We're not lacking in technical prowess to solve a lot of these problems, but we've totally lost it when it comes to our values, what we think is important in the world.
Yeah.
And absolutely, art of all kinds, and music particularly, has a role to play in recentering those values and showing, and both in various ways, you know, both by our fantastic artists like Montaigne and others singing about it and using the powerful medium of song to connect with people, but also that experiential situation that is a festival, the coming together where if it's something that is, I know, sorry, I'm returning to waste, but it's so visual.
Yeah.
If it's something that's low waste, or zero waste, you know, and it's really, there's a lot of care demonstrated while we're partying, I think that can help with the recalibration. That can help us feel like we're belonging to the country, and the care for country sort of is being lived.
I love that you brought us back to care for country as well, because I imagine that's very much where you're coming from, Sharni. Even when you go to other people's properties, you know, how do you manage that to make sure you leave it as you better, do you, than you came in? I mean, if you're bringing a big party in 2,000 people, how do you do it?
Yeah, it's a fascinating juxtaposition, I think, between something like the Porch Sessions, which is travelling music festivals in people's homes. So that's actually in people's backyards, and that's maybe 200 people.
Okay.
And then you go to thing like Porchland, which is our big festival, which is 2,000, and that kind of happens in a clearing in a much more natural space. And I think it's so interesting to see the human behaviour. So when you're in someone's home, there's this unconditional idea of respect for someone's property, and people leave that space and leave that garden just as they've found it. And it's this really beautiful, unspoken thing and normal behaviour of how you interact in someone else's space. But what's interesting is when you go outside of this known relationship between space and between someone's land, and you go out to somewhere like where we host Porchland, it's a different relationship, which I find really, really interesting.
So that's a relationship that we know First Nations people have, Aboriginal people have strongly and deeply.
I was just going to add to that. I feel like, you know, the reason why people perhaps have less respect for land is because colonists came to this land and overhauled the whole thing and embedded their whole system. And when I went to primary school, I learned about the colonists and not about the First Nations people. And colonists' relationship with the land is exploitative and not harmonious. And so we all grow up not respecting the land because we see it as a thing to consume, while First Nations people have for ages and ages, histories beyond histories, like, been here. We just don't have it, and that's the difficulty. We see the Western view is like this constructed building that someone has ownership over is to be respected, while this thing that, like, you know, we just like don't see it. We're so blind to the fact that land is also something to be respected because culturally we're not taught it if you are not an Indigenous person.
So how do you do it, Sharni? How do you obviously, I believe that your principles and your values will take you to a piece of land that you will embed your care for. Are you working with Aboriginal people for that, or is it something that you're finding your way in?
No, absolutely. So something like Porchland is a fascinating site in itself. The site kind of borders both Ghana and Ngarrindjeri country, kind of up on the range outside of Wollonga. So it's been a very interesting conversation kind of around best practice of the land itself. And I think the big conversation for festivals is outside of one date. There's this whole emphasis on utilising this land, coming in, doing the thing and then leaving. But for us, it's about a relationship year-round. It's about regenerating the land after you've taken a little bit from it, but you give it right back. You know, it's absolutely a year-round and lifelong commitment to land that we're lucky enough to use. And that relationship and understanding of culture and First Nations culture is integral to that. absolutely.
So to the future, is it possible to manage to get us back to a carbon neutral, place and continue to do what we're doing, or do you see something really radically different, Berish?
I don't think we can imagine how far we need to get.
No.
That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be. I was watching this session before, and one of the people was saying it's brick by brick. It's not looking at the massive mountain, although look at it from time to time and see the mountain we've got to climb. But I think what Sharni's described being what Montaigne we're all talking about here. There are practical actions you could do today that will move us in that direction. You could divest, like there was a whole session on divestment, and that's practical. You could absolutely strive towards zero waste. You could work towards finding solutions for transport and encouraging everyone to come by bicycles. It's not enough, and I do think, Paul Hawken's provocation, this idea of every sector has to go regenerative. If we've got a chance, we have to turn it around, and that's certainly where First Nations people were on this land. Yeah. They were such great caretakers that the land was more abundant than for their involvement than it was the opposite. And we're just so accustomed to a culture that consumes and destroys. Yeah, and we're going to move towards regeneration. We've got no choice.
Can you see the tipping point?
Sorry?
Can you see the tipping point? Can you see?
Oh, we're close. It's weather. Yeah. I think it's just simply weather.
Yeah. So more floods, more of what we've got in the penny.
I do think so. I just think that we, as much as we try to deny our culture, the mainstream Western culture tries to deny our connection with country, and we lock ourselves up in rooms really successfully. We've got Zoom and it's all wonderful. The weather is really important. It provides the water and the food for us and our shelter, and it's going to show us the way, I hope.
Yeah. What about you, Montaigne? What do you think it might look like, and when's the tipping point coming?
I can't say think about the tipping point too much, because I don't know, I don't find it useful for myself to think about, but I think there's always hope. I think there are a lot of people throughout the world thinking about and acting on these things and actually creating solutions to problems like Berish's, and a whole bunch of people are little things bit by bit, like you say, brick by brick, which is, I think, the most sustainable way to approach it. But yeah, I have faith that we'll get the overall picture right at some point, hopefully. And we are every day getting little things right, and I take a lot of heart in that.
We talked about the fact that there's a lot of campaigning about the planet, and your T-shirts, for example.
Yeah.
What's that about?
It's your baby.
Well, we're heading towards a federal election. I know everyone here is probably more focused on the local election, which I know very little about. I'm happy there's a ban on plastic, but other than that, I'm not quite sure what's happening. But in the federal, situation, we've got champions on all sides of politics. So it's, this campaign, No Music on a Dead Planet, is basically saying, do we want to live in an abundant future? Do we want an abundant future for our children, which is rich in the bird life that gives us pleasure, rich in the trees that give us shade and also nourish our souls, our waterways that we can swim in and drink from? Or do we want that, for me, dystopic future of us isolating ourselves more and more away, letting the ecosystems die, the biodiversity loss and extinction ramp up as it is currently? And if we choose life, I choose that, then now is as good a time as any, and the federal election is a point at which hopefully those champions for that future get more power to them. Whether they're in the Liberal, Nationals, or the Greens, or the Labor Party. Like, I'm party agnostic. That's not my point, and that's not what I think most musicians care about. Is that people give a shit, and those people are given the platform, not pushed to the side by others that have a different agenda. Whether it might be holding on to fossil fuels for dear life for as long as possible, which is what's currently happening.
Yeah. Can I put it to you that partying with the planet and running events and being together and celebrating is about humans connecting, and that we have projected a lot of this about the planet, which is about ecosystem and biodiversity, but ultimately it's about humanity, because will the planet survive?
Yes.
And what does it mean if the planet survives, will nature survive?
Yeah.
But humans won't. So it's actually really quite a consideration around humanity. Can I put that to you? What do you think about the fact that we're not saving the planet, we're saving humanity? And that's a bit more selfish and a bit more, let's party. Do you know what I mean?
Well, like, the only thing we do isn't just partying, right? I think there's a lot worth saving in humanity. Whilst I
Music
for
starters.
True.
Yeah.
You know, whilst I do believe that the crust will simply turn over once we're gone and replenish and thrive and transform into new beautiful things, I think if there is a way for all of us to be able to preserve, you know, our children's children, and allow them to exist and perceive and celebrate a world that is flourishing, I think that would be a lovely thing to achieve. But could go. I'm always going to fight for the better future for the people that I love, but also if humanity, eventually did go extinct, but nature could then thrive and reclaim the space that it once took up, then I'd also be quite happy with that.
How do you feel about that, Sharni? That, you know, nature survives, the planet survives, but we don't. Montaigne's pretty cool with that. How do you feel about it?
I think that's excellent. I think that's almost the dream result, really.
Result. But meanwhile, you're one of these people, like most people here, who are working towards your whole life, celebrating other human beings and ensuring that creative energy is continued and stories are told and people share from each other. Your whole business is humanity. So does it feel contradictory to work with, considering, you know, humanity whilst knowing what we're doing to the planet?
I think our business is in the marriage of humanity with nature. Like all of our events create experiences alongside nature. And so it's about forming those relationships and that understanding. So I think it's very much what we work towards every single day, is to shine a light on the value of that relationship and how maybe one can't prosper without the other. So there's absolutely contradiction, but it's such a fascinating space.
And have you worked with green music before, Sharni, in relation to looking at your events and measuring their impact, etc.?
No, we haven't. I think we've actually spoken on the panel together previously, but not kind of alongside each other in that way. We should, though.
Yeah.
We might be collaborating after this.
Okay, there's a nice little introduction. I'm going to pause at this moment and see if there's a question or anything from the audience that you'd like to ask. There's some people I know in the audience who are deeply involved in this area. In fact, you know, Francoise, sitting down here, has been leading on her own in South Australia a program to ensure that events are leaving a no footprint, pretty much from a waste point of view. And all sorts of organisations. Can I ask you to talk about that for 1 second, Francoise? This is cool.
I was actually just going to point out I thought it was really interesting, the point about when you're in someone's backyard as opposed to another piece of land which you don't feel you're connected to. So I only just thought of this, but how about we don't have cleaners on sites anymore and we make people responsible for their own waste like they do at home? Just, you know. Anyway, so I do this very sort of low-level thing. I have a Facebook page called The French Brace. It's very Adelaide based, where I encourage people to pass on sets and event items that they no longer need. Usually people give them away. There's also now a Sydney equivalent called Bump Out Sydney, who do the same thing. They were very sweet. They rang me and said, "Can we just copy this idea?"
Great.
So they're based mostly out of Griffin. And the other thing is, this is not so much. Well, it's events, and there's a new kind of little group called Sustainable Theatres Australia, which are also trying to get in and make all those sorts of events more sustainable, think about what we do with all our stuff when everybody goes home and we're left with it. So, and I just think that the whole green music thing is incredible, and you're all doing such really amazing work. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Perhaps you should tell us a bit more about exactly what you're doing. I mean, yeah. Besides this campaign, what else is on your plate?
This is going to be a big one in the lead up to the federal election. But, you know...
Thanks, Francois.
Thank you, yeah. That's great. I mean, that's so important. That is part of what we do, is looking at strategic ways that festivals can work together. Like, the Party with the Planet Alliance was the first time that we brought festivals together and they formed an alliance around the sustainability issue. There is some level of competitiveness when it comes to maybe attracting fans. Certainly, structurally, there's issues when an artist will only play a certain number of shows, and you know, if you're able to secure them on your bill, then they maybe you're not playing for the next festival. So there's an innate competitiveness there.
And can I ask, is any of the decision making by an artist to go to an event based on the way in which it might be providing a more carbon neutral space?
I mean, that's maybe a better question for Montaigne.
Yeah, we'll come back.
I feel like, yes, probably for some artists. I'm sure, you know, the answer is probably slightly different after 2.5 years of pandemic and live gigs not really
Give me
happening.
anything.
I think a lot of people kind of feeling that at the moment, but I'm sure, you know, once things start to, once artists start to be able to earn an income once again from live music, people will be making more scrupulous decisions.
So what was the genesis? Was it really just to try and action, to do something with all those?
The genesis was a guy called Tim Hollow, who is both an environmentalist who's done a lot of campaigning with Greenpeace and other recognisable organisations like that, and was also a touring artist. He plays in the band Four Play as a violinist, and he was living these two worlds, trying hard to deal with environmental crisis while touring and going, whoa, there's a bit of a disconnect here. Artists are really well placed to talk about it, and some were absolutely singing about the issues, but then when it comes to the lived reality of a show or of a tour, we're not doing too well. And we could probably do better. And that was, 10 odd years ago. And since then, you've seen some really big changes. There's been complete bans of single-use items in various states, but also in various festival sites where it's not being led by the government, it's certainly being led by the festivals. There's been artists who have committed to a range of things. There's also, like, Coldplay is probably the most noticeable international act that has said we're going to reduce. They've got a baseline figure of what they did in a couple of years ago, and their next tour they're going to reduce it by 50%, including trialling a whole bunch of exciting things like kinetic energy from the dance floor. It's going to help power the lights. Yeah, I mean, when you've got big budgets, you can try interesting things, and hopefully their intention is also that that's a testing ground. That's a piloting stage. So if it works, others can pick it up.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm keen to know more about, what other kind of new technologies might be created by kinetic energy or human power.
I suspect that's a smaller part of the power needs. That's why they're talking about lights, which aren't necessarily super power hungry, but, they're going to be moving solar arrays and batteries around with them and seeing how that works as opposed to your typical diesel generators. There's a lot of exciting stuff that can happen in this space when people put their minds to it. I think in 2019, the energy from the music scene around being better and having witnessed the fires that happened, like the Black Summer fires, was intense. Everyone was really anxious to play their part. There were an enormous amount of benefit gigs that were being thrown, and artists were giving their talent away for free to raise money for those victims that are affected, but also for a whole bunch of exciting organisations like Fire Sticks Alliance that are, an Indigenous group that are looking at cultural burning practices, to try and stop the fires from happening in the first place.
Yeah.
So artists were giving everything to it, their voice and their money. And then, of course, 2 years of pandemic, and that shattered the industry. So we're in a bit of a different spot at the moment.
Yeah, I think you're all being very buoyant, frankly, considering this is probably one of your first gigs you've had for a while, is it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think I managed to get a couple last year when it sort of, the pandemic seemed to sort of be lightening up a little bit, and then obviously new variants sort of kicked in. So I got to play a couple last year, but yeah, otherwise this is, I've had like maybe 5 shows so far this year or something like that, which is crazy.
It's funny because I think, you know, today the South Australian government lifted some more COVID bans so we can dance tomorrow night. That'll be good for you, Sharni, for those gigs. And yeah, things are changing, but I imagine if we were talking in another year's time, perhaps post COVID again, when we're really back to that high level of what we used to. I agree. Right now we haven't actually seen a huge amount of gigs. Have you been doing many, Sharni? How do you do it with COVID?
Yeah. I guess like from our peak, kind of before COVID, we were pumping out maybe 30 shows a year, and we've kind of like run 4 in the last 2 years, so that's great. But yeah, put our energy into different projects, and we'll come back when we can.
Great, thank you. I can see I've got a question from Matthew. Go for it, Matthew.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all for your leadership and your advocacy in this. I'm curious about joy and where you've all gained joy from this work that you're doing in performance, in managing, and I just wonder if there's something you recall from recent times that you'd like to share.
I might start with Sharni while you have a think about that, if that's right. How are you going with that?
Such a beautiful, beautiful question, and such an important one. My gosh. Yeah, I think actually 2 weeks ago, there were still restrictions in place, but we put on maybe our first show in, I think, 10 months. And it was kind of a very, very general process for me to kind of bring it all together and connect people, do it safely, bring the band in, set it all up. And there was this absolute euphoric moment when the gig started, and it sounded amazing, and the band were electric, and the crowd were just loving it. And there is no greater expose of joy for me in this field. I think, if anything, it was this beautiful reminder of like, oh my God, I love this more than anything else in the world, and I want to be in this industry forever. So for me, that's my absolute, I'm getting a bit emotional thinking about it. That's my absolute joy moment, most recently, for sure.
Thank you, Sharni. Montaigne?
Oh yeah, I think, you know, similar anecdote, it was my first headline show in maybe 2 years in Melbourne, and it was a fairly full room, which I was shocked by, because all artists have, you know, had trouble shifting tickets in the last, you know, little while since they've been able to put on gigs again. People, you know, it's still a bit of a precarious time, and I think my fans especially are generally like very thoughtful, sensitive people who care about other people, and so they also tend to not take risks. But this room was relatively full, and it was just the first time I played a gig to people who knew all the words to my song and related to those words, and it was the nicest thing ever, and it really reaffirmed what I do, I suppose, because when, you know, making the music is a very isolated or solitary process. You're alone in a room or wherever you are, or maybe with a few collaborators and stuff like that, and you're just hoping that the thing you make stirs some kind of empathy in other people, and then to actually present it to them and realize, yes, we all actually do we are all able to share things that are intangible. I think that's a very joy-inspiring connection. Yeah.
Deep connection, that's lovely.
Yeah.
And you, have you?
I mean, it's just a relief to be in person right now.
Yeah.
I'm over the Zooms. Oh, look, I'm in this job because I love music. I'm a pianist by trade, and toured with the likes.
A pianist.
Pianist, yeah. I travelled with the likes of Vicar and Linda Bull. That's probably the most recognisable act I can say on stage. And you know, connection, that crowd to musician connection, when it works, it's the most thrilling thing in the world. It's just absolutely. And there's a quote that I'm going to completely muddle up and misquote, but something about, I'm not going to be part of your revolution unless I can dance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that sums it up. Like we want a revolution. Let's be honest. Like we don't want it to be bloody. We want it to be joyous. We want the massive capital machine that's at play to pivot towards something that's good for thriving for every species, including humans. But I think we want to dance on the way there and sing on the way there. And joy is going to help get us closer to that point than heap of anger.
Good. Well, that's great. Yeah, thank you.
I think also just to add one last thing, I think the beautiful thing about music is that it is evidence that you don't need a material thing in order to have joy and have connection and all this stuff. It is just it's something
deeply fulfilling.
Yeah, and you don't have to consume anything physical. It's just like a natural connector that doesn't require like the exploitation of anything.
We talked about Coldplay generating kinetic energy on this dance floor, but do you feel there is an energy, right? Is there an actual energy transfer in a gig?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, you can sort of boil it down to just biological things and chemicals and adrenaline and all that stuff, but even if you can break that down into its very specific objective parts, I think we are very good at meaning making, and it's a beautiful thing that feels sort of I guess soul and emotion based when you are in a room full of people and there is a transfer of energy that does feel non-scientific, I suppose.
It's classic, isn't it? That one of the biggest bands in the world will turn into science as well. Well, it's maybe a bit of all of it. I know they're not going to pick up on the love, but maybe they are. Who knows? Transfer that into some sort of shift. Sharni, how are you feeling? Are you actually well?
I feel like the lipstick is really helping me right now.
Yeah. I can see that there's another question at the microphone, so I'll go over to Tully.
Hi. This morning when Rachel Healy was introducing the day's work, she was talking about the way that the Adelaide Festival is modelled on the Edinburgh International Festival, which itself was a post-war groundswell of intention to bring that humanity back. And so this draws upon what you were saying, Christie, about the humanity, but what everybody was saying, about the work, that intangible benefit that festivals do, and whether we do that in this most material way or whether we do that in a less material intensive way. There's a lot of different models for that. But the cost of changing that model, it feels different in Australia than it does in Europe, where we might see our friends talk about those trains to different cities. We can't really do that quite as well until we get that fast train here in Australia. And when I impact on that. Do you think there are ways that we can think about models for festivals, but also models for artists' careers that can be more aware of the fact that the cost of responding to climate emergency is going to play a role on artists' lives and actions in different ways? It's going to be different for us here in Australia than it is for an artist in the middle of Europe.
Montaigne?
I'm a bit lost on the question, admittedly.
It's different for artists in Australia than it is for artists in Europe, and that's going to have career implications for Australian artists that aren't going to be the same, experience the same way for artists in Europe. And I'm wondering if there are things that we can do to help with that, or to maybe we're going to have to redraw what a successful career looks like.
Are you talking predominantly, Tully, in relation to transport and travel and the carbon off?
That's a big part of it, yeah. I mean, I think, if people are going to be choosing not to travel in order to take up residencies go to these festivals, how do we help artists deal with that change here in Australia?
Sharni, I'll go to you for a minute because you're dealing with a model that's trying to do that, right?
Yeah, I think I'm still trying to navigate that a little bit. But I guess like mostly like we kind of speak to local Australian music in terms of the festivals and events that we put on, and whether that's local or whether it's the events that we tour. And I guess I think when you kind of zoom out, it is a very different climate of what you're looking at between the Northern Hemisphere and Europe and music and arts in that space as what we do here in Australia. But I guess for most of us that have been born and bred in this zone, it's kind of all we've known. So you learn and you grow up with, I guess, integrating practice to speak to our territory, to speak to the space between shows, and to speak with working what we've got here, if that makes sense.
I think, yeah, thank you. I think it might also talk a bit to your point earlier, Berish, about just the system differences between Europe and the way in which they look at art and manage music and pay for things and have a kind of social good, if you will, written into their history of understanding art and so on. And that may also play into how we are as artists in Australia.
I mean, it's a great and difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not sure whether I'm taking it right, but if an artist is really sincere about in their intention to try and reduce their footprint and live ecologically, live in alignment with the planet, that it's particularly difficult in Australia because of the tyranny of distance between cities, if I'm understanding that part of what's being said there. And it's easier where there's dense, where you've got Europe with better transport and population centres that are much closer together. And that's a real challenge that we face, and it's certainly something that could help if the government's enabled more sustainable transport, but there are other, I'm sure, inventive ideas. It's not like people haven't tried to do slow touring in Australia, and that is, move between city centres or town centres a lot more slowly. And obviously, slow tends to, when it comes to transport, slow tends to align with more sustainable. If we walk or if we ride, versus if we drive, versus if we bus it, and then we go all the way over to flying, and that's tends to be the heaviest carbon footprint. But before you move on, there are interesting things being tried all over the place. There's a European group that have started to pay, I think out of Germany, grants to people, to artists directly, who can come up with an innovative way of doing a tour that's low on touring emissions.
Great.
They're paying them to investigate, explore, try.
There's my little moment to put a call to action. The City of Adelaide, where I work, is actually certified carbon neutral. All of our energy is coming from renewable sources. So that is not the whole city, of course, it's just the City of Adelaide. Buildings and anything we use power for, which does include this park. But we have actually got a climate planning, there's some stuff going on at the moment that we need people to feed in their ideas, because we're about to go into another phase of climate action planning, and so it's on the Your Say at the moment. So there's a little plug to go to the City of Adelaide's website and put in some ideas to help with that. That'd be great. And I also need to let you know, there's another question here, and I'm a bit nervous about this one. Hi, Dad. Not even joking.
I should have come in disguise. I just want to follow on what Tony said and what you were just talking about then, because Christie, last time you were in Edinburgh, you came back saying that a lot of the artists were meeting and they were really worried about the cost of particularly flying. I'm just wondering, can you add any more to what's been said in the last 3 years?
I can't at the moment, but I think to Montaigne's point, it's about living by your principles and knowing that you can't control everything, and knowing that there has to be investment. There has to be system change and investment in technology in order to reduce carbon.
I was actually just going to add as part of that, and also part of what you were saying. So I live in Sydney, New South Wales, and Sydney used to have nightlife, and because of residential development and moneyed people who own properties complaining about noise, a lot of our nightlife has been gutted, and the government has, in place of very iconic and important venues in Sydney, replaced them with, apartment complexes, and it's happening all the time. The Lansdowne just went under. It was like one of the most, fundamental venues in Sydney, the most central, and that's just one symptom of the way that the state does not think about the arts industry at all. Like, even any of the grants or, budget additions during the pandemic, none of them were actually helpful. It was never enough money, and it was never to the right people. And I think in Europe as well, like, because of maybe the cultural appreciation of art and also the population density and the closeness of cities, it's like there's a lot of venues, a lot of things happening all the time. There are a lot of places for artists to play. There's a lot of opportunities for them to make a dime doing the thing that they do for a job. In Australia, there are so few places to play.
I hear that you're saying you really don't feel as respected as you should be as an artist.
No, but also just like, it's hard for artists to shill out for, environmentally sustainable practices because there's just no money.
Yeah.
Except unless you do a branded sponsorship with some fucking corporation that's cranking out socks for like $1, pair or something like that, cent a pair.
And we come back to that thing about whose responsibility is it, and it's difficult as a lightning rod to walk the talk as well as actually,
it's like, it's a tough conversation because you do want to play a part as an individual, and those are my principles. I'm an environmentalist as well, and I want to wear my badge and also follow through on the actions that it purports to support. But at the same time, it's very difficult when you live in a capitalist world and there is no money in the thing that you're doing.
Yeah, I hear you. Did you want to say anything? We're going to wrap up. In fact, I'm told I was allowed to go over a little tiny bit of time, but we do have to lean in and watch one more thing on the screen. So unless you wanted to wrap up there.
I thought that was beautiful, what I'm saying. There needs to be a greater appreciation for the arts here. And I would say from a more local perspective, I lived in the Surf Coast. I'm from Melbourne, but I lived on the Surf Coast for the last 18 months, and there's a fantastic venue in Adelaide. There's many fantastic venues in Adelaide. There's a fantastic venue in Anglesey, which is heading towards Vaughan. And there are many, actually, Castlemaine, others. I think there has been some serious investment from the big government to support these regional venues, and that does give artists a bit more of a chance to tour slowly. You can't tour slowly if there's one place in Sydney, one place in Melbourne, one place. It's too far away. One place in Perth. So I think investment in those regional centres. People really want to see music out there often. That's just another kind of. I can't begin to say the amount of innovation that could happen in this space if people sat down and really tried to help artists green their tours. But at the moment, artists are doing a lot. They're doing a lot of heavy lifting, and they're not necessarily turning.
I'll just say one last very quick thing. Local and state government, there's a bunch of things that are really great that local and state government do. Like, depending on the local and state government, it's the federal government that eats shit most of the time. Anyway, let's go to the next thing.
You're going to get a little round of applause there. Well, on that note, there is another session on this stage in a minute about carbon neutrality. Explain how exactly, what are we talking about when we're talking about carbon neutral. I've mentioned already to have your say, and we've got some colleagues of mine involved in more sessions this afternoon. We've got a little video to show you before we wrap up, which is actually of an artist who's doing his best to walk the talk. It's Tim Minchin, and he is going to be, what's he doing? This is actually something that he did with his whole band back in a tour in 2021 called Back, as part of looking at minimising the footprint of his whole tour. So the band and the crew, they spent the day planting trees and shrubs to assist the property's regeneration project. And it's a really great example of how we can do what we do differently, but he's taken on that point of personal responsibility because he can, I guess. He's got the ability to do that in the sort of size of artist he is. But let me now ask you to join me in thanking these beautiful people and wishing them all the best to save the planet, to party on, and thank them for coming to Adelaide. Now you guys can hop off while we all watch the screen.
They went. Oh no. Where's the audio? We're down. Oh, we've lost it. We've lost the audio output. We've lost the audio output.
Just troubleshooting.
We've lost them.
Don't go.
There we are. Which we have a hit? Not on the side, not on the stage. Okay, so do we just reset the system? Pause the recording and redo it? Let's do that.
How long are you guys? A couple minutes?
Hello everyone, Tim Minchin here, coming from a very sexy beige hotel room in Toowoomba in Queensland. I'm at the end of a 15-hour day, so you'll forgive me if I sound drunk. I wish I was drunk. I'm not. We were so honoured and had so much fun working with Bea on greening our back tour last year. We did lots of little things, really, trying to use reusables and compostables backstage, and having a green rider, and not using plastic water bottles. And Bea came up with these gorgeous QR codes that linked to our greening page that told people what we were doing and encouraged them to take their own measures to try and be green on the way to our concerts. Those QR codes could then be put in the ground, and apparently they turned into plants. There were seeds embedded in them. I'd like to know how that went. The best thing we did was this fantastic planting day, which you'll see more about. It was so special for so many reasons. But also, obviously, sequestered some carbon, in theory, in the future. Over the next 30 years, we'll be paying off our debt. I just think, obviously, the doing of the greening is important, but equally, we in the arts and in entertainment in general have a role in communicating positive stories. That's what our job is, really, or at least stories that illuminate or hold a mirror up or encourage. And one of the stories I want to tell is this story, and it's not a lecture, it's not a look what we're doing, you losers should be doing it. It's a journey for us to try and figure out how to be a little bit more responsible and sustainable, and hopefully in going through that journey and in learning from people like Bea, allowing that process to be observed encourages other people to go on their own journey. It's a humble and unremarkable step in the right direction, but I do think it's a step in the right direction, and I do want to be an example for younger touring acts to show that it doesn't cost anything, and things like planting with your band and crew, it's a profoundly bonding experience. It's great. Get out of the hotel, get your hands in the earth. So I had a great time. I'm sorry if this has been a ramble. Thank you, Bea. Cheers from Toowoomba, baby. Rock. I think the biggest trouble is people like me, for all our intentions and pseudo-activism, are the problem. I travel a lot and I have a very big footprint, and so the hardest thing is how far back you have to come.
Touring, let's face it, I mean, we fly a lot. We have pretty big carbon footprint. We have trucks roaming across the country, back and forth. And if we don't do something, then that's pretty woeful.
We are out here at Lot 50K, which is part of a biocultural experience, and this planting is part of a broader initiative across Tim's tour that we're pulling together. Just look at the entire tour's footprint and where we can reduce things, where we can make some changes. These smaller stories, and the story we're trying to tell is one of more grassroots community involvement and just getting everyone in on a conversation.
We've got 500 seconds to get around, so let's go. Gavin Malone, land steward for an area here we call Lot 50, Gun and a Pillar. I am absolutely chuffed that Tim and his troupe have chosen to be here today. I think providing leadership within the arts and the performing industry, absolutely key. And Tim's ability to communicate is fantastic. He will give the message further and further.
People should come out here and they should talk, about what these things are, what these ideas are, and if we do that, there's going to be more creative, more consultative, more impactful thinking about what it is that we hold now and how we place that in the future. With what's happening right now with Tim and the tour and everything else, and doing this and coming out here to Gun and a Pillar, L50K, sets a benchmark.
Coming up with an environmental policy on the road is super important to reduce the footprint and the waste that we have, even down to, reusable merchandise bags, and when we go into venues actually stating what our policy is on single-use plastics. The band has a real unique position here to be able to establish those rules, I guess, that they should follow through.
Well, sure. I mean, you a big crew of people on the road, burning a lot of fossil fuels to get where you need to go. I think, the touring industry is definitely a heavy user of all those resources. So it's good to be able to come somewhere beautiful like this and, get your hands on and do something. It's great. I think if there was a network maybe available for people to do that in localised regions, where you could go, okay, well, we've got this tour coming up and we estimate this is the amount of carbon we're going to use over this tour, then there's a small tree plot where, it can just be bush regeneration projects going around, and they're happening everywhere, I think it's all pretty achievable, yeah.
Also sort of trying to take a role as an educator sort of thing, and by which I mean by other people witnessing us learning about this, they get to learn about it too.